First of all, I understand this content gets recorded as part of our podcast, as Daniel said, and I'm going to timestamp this. It'll someday when I listen to this, I'll remember this. I don't know if you're all aware of this, but Kentucky lost yesterday, and we are big fans of my family, and I'm just in a bit of mourning. So if we could just start there. 2022 March Madness, Kentucky's out of the tournament. I know some of you are crying, weeping right now. It's a struggle, but it's real. So let's get into this. So when I did my TEDx that Daniel was referencing, that was a manifesto. I wanted to take a moment, a manifesto, but a manifesto on the importance and what it means to develop whole leaders, and the title, Becoming Whole Leaders in a Broken World, that we have a world that is full of brokenness. And what does it mean for us to move toward our aspiration for wholeness? And this topic today is really getting at the heart of a piece of that and a piece of our work. One of the things that I mentioned several years ago that just became a part of this mantra for me, and I hope this doesn't sound like I was aspiring to fame, but here's what I thought. I always thought, like, what I wanted was this possibility that someday we would be our community of people, not just the people that work for WiLD Leaders, but our community would be on the cover of Fast Company magazine, or whatever the hot magazine at the time was, because Fast Company was pretty cool back then, it's like, and I wanted it to be us to be on the cover. And this is what I thought it would say. If it was a sort of a mandate about what this is all about, and it would say this: all we did was focus on the one. All we did was focus on the one. And I can, this is what much of this topic today is about, is what does that mean to focus on the one, to see a person, and also to maintain a focus on the many, with an eye to the many. And I think about it this way, that when you become a leader, immediately, one of the realities is that you are now responsible for everyone and everyone. You're responsible for seeing individuals, but also for the experience of the many, and for scaling systems and processes. And I think one of the things that's a reality of this is that it's difficult to do that, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And as I get into this, I'm gonna go a little philosophical, if you allow me to do that. I'm also going to bring up a little bit of research, but I hopefully it also will be fairly practical, because I think there are implications for this in terms of our worldview and how we see things that have direct implications for how we actually train and develop leaders in our organizations. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. One is that one of the jobs I had, it was a management job where I had, direct leadership responsibility for a group of leaders, and they were leading people themselves. And one of the things over the years in leading that team was that as the leader, one of my jobs was I described it like sort of managing or holding a ball of yarn. So this responsibility, even in meetings where that leadership team was together, sometimes the people on that team would go right at each other. Like, they would say stuff like, we would get in pretty heated arguments about certain things, but it was always in a spirit of love. But at the same time, we would do that. And so one of my jobs was, a couple of these folks really went at each other a lot, and would say, like, sometimes they would say things like, well, if that's the way you're going to do it, then I won't do anything. I'll just step back. I just won't do anything. Like, they would just kind of check out, which they weren't really checking out, but they got kind of ticked off. So they did that. So over the years, my job was to hold that. Well, one of those leaders who had that up, and that, by the way, that going at each other is an important part of progress and innovation. So fighting well is important. But when one of those leaders ended up being my successor in that role, one of the things that I wanted to leave with him is that you no longer get to play the same way you played before, because now you're not just responsible for yourself, but now you're trying to hold that whole team together. And so begin to think about, as he took over my role in that, as one of the things I was hoping to kind of work with him on, and he completely understood that and leads in his own great way. But it was just that moment. I also think what's interesting is I brought this up. I was on a plane yesterday, and it's kind of fun to talk about whole leader development with whoever. And I was sitting next to this guy, and he told me what he does, and he owns about a 80-person business in the trades. And I was telling him about this, and I said, hey, can you tell me, like, when I talk about this focusing on the one with an eye to the many, what does that cause you to think about? And I just took a bunch of notes, and he said this. He talked about as a leader not having the time to invest in the manager who is responsible for the technician. So in their business, that's what they call them, as technicians, right? So, and he said, you'll have a contentious relationship between the technician and the manager, maybe, that people bring from their everyday lives. These were his words. And you have to know when they're swinging at you to hurt you or when they're swinging at you because that's the way they operate in their world. Isn't that fascinating? The way that's what my question about this content today made him think about. And he said the problem comes, this is more what he said, when the manager makes a decision to write this individual off. Like, why did they do that? Because they don't have, in this manager not having the leadership skills. And it's interesting. He said sometimes these managers that I in my organization, they're proud to be a manager of technicians, but that doesn't make them better managers. They have to carry that promotion. They carry it as if it's a badge. If the manager doesn't have strong vision and doesn't put the day-to-day aside and the relationships, or he said, put the data aside and manage for the whole and for the future, then that manager makes a decision that you've swung at me too many times. And that relationship gets worse and worse. And so then he said, we hired an HR manager because they had to have places where they could go, someone else to talk with. And it just went on. And he just went on and on about this challenge. And he said, the larger challenge is that we then lose someone that we probably would not have lost. And hiring and firing and training is a huge task and risk for us. We've invested faith in a manager and the cost is high, is what he said. And then what I talked to him about is that bringing in that HR manager, that's going to be another taxing role because that person's going to, instead of being able to forward develop people, is going to be kind of managing things like this. And it's interesting. I was also, one of my dearest and oldest friends, because we went to high school together. His name is Jeff. And Jeff said something to me a few years back that really changed the way that I think about working with my own teams. And he said this, and I'd never thought about this before. He said, I think someone else had told him this, or it just came from his brilliant brain, but he said, never reprimand an entire team when you have an individual or a couple of individuals who are actually the problem. And it shouldn't be rocket science, but it was. Because you think about that, if you reprimand an entire team all at once, everybody, and you really only have one or two people, what does the team think? They all think it's their problem, like they're the ones. And so now you just demotivated the entire team when you could have had those conversations one-on-one. I bring all that up because this is the tension that we face at a management level, is between seeing an individual and paying attention to them, their development needs, maybe also their performance challenges, but also being responsible for the larger system. And one of the realities we see, and one of the reasons that leader development programs are oftentimes soul suckers, and they lack that humanity, is because the necessity as we grow and scale is to create systems that scale. And as soon as we systematize leader development and lose track of the person for whom we are developing those things and seeing them as whole, we start to lose track of the human part of this. And what I'm not beating us up for that, but saying, like, we have to hold that tension more effectively. So let me dive into some philosophical parts of this. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the experience and needs of each individual is what matters most, or that we are first and foremost called to serve the needs of the many? And if you're like me, your answer is probably both. It's the answer that feels appropriate, because while we want to serve the needs of every person, that desire lives in tension with the necessity for taking care of the needs of everyone, even if it may diminish our capacity to serve the needs of the one. We want to do both, but there is little denying that it's tough to do both. When we make exceptions to pay attention to the one, we sometimes miss the needs of the many. And if you've ever been in a traffic jam on a freeway where you're one of thousands of cars that are slowed to a crawl, you know what I mean. It's not until you come upon the actual thing that stopped traffic that you realize what was actually happening. After an hour or two waiting in traffic, you finally pass the scene of a 3-car collision and you see the pained faces of those involved. That's when you see the bigger picture. Thousands were waiting, but 3 people were hurting. The thousands trying to get to their destinations matter. They matter. And so do those 3 individuals. And in my last book, Composed, the Heart and Science of Leading Under Pressure, I described the fundamental tension we face between making life all about us or making life all about others. And that tension is about understanding our habitual tendencies to be either overly convicted or overly connected to others, and the different sacrifices that may be necessary if we're thinking about individuals and thinking about the interactions of individuals together. And in our daily lives, we see a radical focus typically on one of 2 polar opposites. On the one end, we see an emphasis on individual liberty, accountability, and responsibility. And on the other end, we see deep convictions about the necessity for looking out for the many. And a radical focus on either individual liberty or care for the many without attention to the other puts us on a reckless path so far from our human experience. And without paying attention to both the individual and the individual in a larger social or organizational context, we completely may miss the point. And we do often miss the point. And as a result, I do think sometimes we miss the whole truth, that we are drawn to oversimplified solutions to our most complex challenges, but oversimplified solutions to complex realities will never quench our thirst for wholeness or bring us any closer. And I think it's in embracing the reality that individuals are and individuals are together that we move closer to that, what I might describe as a redemptive future ahead. And while that deeper truth is so important for me to understand if I'm to move closer to wholeness, paying attention to the influence of culture and science and our personal experience, I think, is equally important. And so I want to go there for just a second. Just let me go scientific for just a moment. I'll get back to some of you are like, where's the practical stuff? And some of you are like, bring it, McKenna, let's go deep. So here's a couple on the scientific side. Science is often, I don't want to beat up on science. I'm a scientist, right? I am. I've practiced science, in the deepest ways for a long time. So I'm not beating up on science, but sometimes science has often been pasteurized one step away from our human reality, a deeper and whole conversation of what it means to be whole, but it's still confirming some really important things about us. So for example, do you have any idea how much research has been done on bias? Like how biased we are as human beings is science just confirms kind of what we already know. And so in most of psychological science and research has actually confirmed a lot of very human things, but oftentimes some of the values and the deeper questions around for the sake of whom and the value orientation of even sacrifice of myself for the sake of someone else is not really talked about. But still, on the surface, the science does address some human things. So as a psychologist and someone who has given his heart and his life to the possibility of more intentionally supporting the development of whole leaders, I've been so impacted by my field. Like I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. That's Daniel's training, that's Megan's training, and many of you on here have this same training. And I would suggest that we have all been impacted. We have all read the books that have taken psychological science, pasteurized it just enough to make it consumable, and passed them around to our friends and coworkers as truth. And without completely dismissing the help that many of those books and movements have provided, it's also so important that we understand the fundamental assumptions behind the research by psychologists and social psychologists. And let me confess that I believe there is so much truth in what we've learned, and that we don't listen to the research that is, we don't tend to listen to research that's qualified or that opens with what it did not confirm. We are drawn to books that draw conclusions we want. And we're repelled by research and research-based books that fail to confirm our existing assumptions. There's that bias we have to be careful about. Most of psychology is focused on the psychology of the individual. And much of the research has been about that. Even some of the most popular trends in modern culture are radically focused on us with a reckless disregard for the relational and systemic nature of everything in our world. And either way could be reckless. So do not hear me beating up on one side or the other, but we just to be thoughtful about that. And so so leadership research, what was interesting is it didn't even hint at the systemic nature of human relationships until like the 80s and 90s. It was that recent when things like contingency theories of leadership were born, or leader member exchange was investigated, which I don't want to explain what that's all about, but like there's a social exchange that happens, that there is an exchange going on, that leaders and others are interconnected. And we got started there. And so we know that's true. And so one of the things that's a practical tension when you think about the reality in organization is coming back to that, how do I see the individual, but how do I also understand the individual functioning within groups? Okay, and I'm going to go a little deeper on a sort of a psychological perspective on this, because it's a practical reality that happens in organizations. I think it's precisely why so many leader development programs are quite literally, they just feel so detached from our reality. But the challenge you face is when it becomes closer to our reality, it gets a little personal. You know what I'm saying? It gets a little personal. And so let me just describe something else from a philosophical kind of research perspective. The alternative to an either or approach to the tension between me as an individual, or like you as an individual, and we as a collective requires an embracing of both and holding that tension. While much of our behavior and many of our assumptions have been driven by individualized psychological science, and still are, we should embrace what our friends in the clinical side of psychology have known for years. And this, I think this is a great thing for managers too. If you're a manager going like, so McKenna, I'm going to give you some practical things to think about in a second. Our understanding of our world is more fully informed by embracing a nomothetic and an idiographic view of a reality at the same time. And I'm going to tell you what these things mean. Adopting a nomothetic approach to your world is to look for patterns of commonality across groups of individuals. This is why so many leadership programs, and then we talk about this all the time, that WiLD is, we're really about leaders and not leadership, and someone needs to be about leadership, but so much of leadership theory is based on average things across individuals, which is important to understand. That there are certainly common themes, but here's why most 5-step programs to being a great leader fall short, is because it finishes with a nomothetic. It finishes with 5 principles that are supposed to work for everybody. And those 5 principles may work for many, many people, but they may not work for the individuals, or they may work themselves out in individual kinds of ways. And so, and here, let me give you a research example. For example, if a study of women suggests that women will tend to see their world, to behave or feel the same way on average, that would be important to understand. Okay? However, the assumption that all women will act in the same way or feel the same way is ridiculous. So embracing a nomothetic reality becomes necessary in so many important places in our lives. For example, if we're to understand common illnesses faced by women that may differ from men, that would be important information to know, but also not to put every individual in the same box. So for leaders responsible for larger groups of people, it's equally important and necessary to understand patterns that differ between groups. But however, if all of our focus is on the many and averages across populations, we can quickly lose sight of the wonder and beauty of individual differences. While most men may be more or less assertive, you hear this, I've heard it over the years, right? They may be more or less assertive. Where does that leave me as a man if I don't fit that average? The point is that our challenge and responsibility is to identify potential patterns across groups of people that may inform our decisions, while never assuming that any individual person fits the patterns that have been shown to be there across populations. And do you hear me? Because embracing both is a tension. And so anybody that it's like fighting for your side right now, it's like, you got to see the other side, because both matter. And I think our job is to focus on the one while keeping an eye on the many, to see that. So let me get a little practical for just a moment, like some things to think about, because this affects the way that we approach leader development. It affects it all the time. This capacity to actually see an individual, and to maintain the reality that as our organizations grow, or even if you have a team of people, you're also responsible to understand kind of, how am I going to provide this at scale? Like, that's one of the fundamental challenges we face. So here are a couple things. I want to get practical as we get out. Some of you are like, so give me some practical things, Rob. So where would you begin? So I have 3 things. Number 1 is this, I would say, commit to both and maintain it. Commit to both and maintain it. And what I mean by that is to be discerning about this, and is it takes maintenance, because we will end up defaulting to one or the other. And we have to think about how do we manage that tension between the individual and the needs of the group. I mean, there's some deep philosophy around this. You ever took a philosophy class in college? They're like, is it about, would you sacrifice the one to save the many? Would you sacrifice the many to save the one? And that's why I'm not going to give you an answer to that. I'm saying that I think from a leadership perspective, we have to see both. We have to understand that that's the hard part of the job. Number 2 is this: looking with people and not at them. An example of looking at people would be this. You ever heard a person who starts sentences with, look, and I've been guilty of this, look, and then I'm about to tell you what to do, right? It's not a conversation. I'm about to tell you, look, and typically that same sentence will end with, look, and then I say blah, 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 and then I say, okay. So I've just told you. So, and I think there's times for that kind of directness about, we have performance issues we got to face. I'm not saying that there isn't time for that, but so often that's our default. And this is why we talk about the importance of invitation into development, that that questions are such a key part of what it means to develop people. It's also why the WiLD Toolkit, for example, we talk about that you put tools in people's hands, and there it's a common language for development, which is what the WiLD Toolkit is about, for whole person development. That's a powerful and necessary common language and structure and scaffolding. But when combined with a conversational architecture that opens up a little bit of vulnerability, that's when the power of that common language gets released. And we're going to talk, if you're sticking around for this entire Becoming WiLD session, we're going to talk more about that in the second hour. But that's what, so to look with people and not simply at them. And we typically, it's so typical across business contexts, especially, to look at folks, as as opposed to inviting them into their own development. Number three is this: build systems that scale, but emphasize the culture and practice of seeing individuals. Build systems that scale, but see individuals. So in other words, like, I can't say enough about this is what we do, is provide a system that can scale this conversation to all levels of leadership or an organization and all employees. But at the same time, that same system is structured for conversations regarding the psychological principles of things that are going on in people already that they would love to talk about and be seen about. So we're going to jump into this conversation. Dr. Halleck, will you